Hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining us on Podbites with Verna. I'm Verna Collins Odom, and on today's Podbite, we're doing a feature piece. We're highlighting someone who is operating in her life calling. As I spoke to her, our discussion was quite interesting, and I learned a great deal about what motivates her. It's a little bit about what she does, but it's a lot about who she is. That featured guest is Melanie Allen. She is impacting lives every day in her role as the co-founder and co-director of the Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice. Thank you so much for being here with us, Melanie.
Thank you for having me, Verna.
Of course, you took on that role we talked about in 2019. You've done some very interesting work there. I want to talk about that in a couple of minutes, but take us back first. You have a really compelling story about how you got interested in the social justice arena. And it started really when you were a child. As a parent, when you were talking to me about it, it was hard to hear, and I'm sure it was hard to live it, a tough situation in your life. You felt like you had become, in your words, a burden to your parents. I'm going to start the timer now. Tell me about that time.
Sure. Well, I come from Greensboro, North Carolina, and a family and church very involved in the civil rights movement. But my personal story with social justice work started when I was 13 and I got really sick. And I went to several doctors trying to figure out what happened, what was wrong. And when I was finally diagnosed with a chronic illness, it was right around the time that my father left his good government job to start his own business. And what that meant was that the insurance companies that insured the rest of my family would not insure me because I had a pre-existing condition. And at that point, I needed several hospital stays and ended up having surgery. And so my parents were trying to figure out how we were going to pay for this without insurance. And I really did feel like a burden, and also began to ask questions about why this was okay and why there were laws and policies that said that this was okay. And it really drove me to begin looking at places like Raleigh and Washington, D.C., where people were making decisions about my life, and understand how or if I could have an impact. And when I left North Carolina to go to college in New York, I connected with the Children's Defense Fund, and I worked there pretty much all throughout college. And one of the roles that I had there was a youth organizer. And I worked closely with other young people in New York who wanted to extend child health insurance benefits because, like me, they were experiencing their own health issues and knew that they needed health coverage. And so many of the young people that I worked with had experiences with things like asthma that were impacted or adversely affected by environmental factors. And it really made the connection between health and the environment for me then, but also just strengthened my commitment to making sure that people like me who were most impacted and had experiences that were deeply shaped by policies were at the table and able to help shape the decisions that were impacting our everyday lives.
So you really had an early awareness of this, and really, I guess, a vulnerability you realized that your family had, not wanting others to go through this as well. Then you took a series of opportunities to work toward that goal of social justice and social change. You worked on community development projects. You talked about some of them: conservation, affordable housing, workforce development. What did you learn from that kind of work?
It's a great question. I have been fortunate to work in many different sectors, and one thing that remains true is that people who are experiencing our most persistent challenges most acutely have thought deeply about what solutions could look like, how our systems could be better, and should be at the table when we are developing those solution sets. Too often they're brought in at the very end, and so they can only kind of have superficial input, that's too late. And I've really dedicated my life and career to making sure that people from front lines, people from fence lines, folks who are most proximate to problems are also at the very beginning engaged in helping to shape solutions.
In your position at the Hive Fund, you're giving grants to organizations to help in their efforts to address what you refer to as the intersection of climate, gender, and racial justice in the U.S. Let's take this conversation out of the esoteric space. For some, if they can't feel it, if they can't touch it, if it doesn't affect their lives, why do they care? Okay, we want to maybe give this topic some attention that those who are impacted by it would argue it deserves. They feel that there needs to be funding. You talk about that. They want change. But how do you do that? How do you make people who are not impacted or don't engage engage?
That's a great question. And that is, a question that many people in my sector spend a lot of time answering. What I like to say is that the environment is that issue that really intersects with all issues. And I think about it like I think we all have a place in our communities that maybe we drive by or walk by, and you may smell something when you walk by a factory. For us here in North Carolina, it may be driving by a hog farm. And so we know that something's not quite right. Something is going on. That is an indicator. And for us, it may be a drive-by experience. But for some people, particularly the people who live close by, or even the people that work there, it's a persistent experience that not only has the unpleasant smell as a side effect that they have to deal with, but also often long-term health and other implications and challenges that are born of those experiences with these industries. And so when I think about why we should care, it is, of course, because of those immediate impacts. And I think we should care about those communities. But what we've also learned is that those impacts are long-ranging and far-reaching. And so air pollution is kind of one of those root causes we have of something like what we call climate change. And so we are all experiencing it, even if we are not in those kind of front or fence line communities, when we have now the hottest year on record every single year, or 100-year storms now happening every year or every other year, and areas that have never experienced flooding before now being persistently underwater. I think about it in this way. I think that we should care because, an industry like electricity is something that we all rely on. And we have the ability that when we flip a light switch, for us not to be contributing to the health challenges of someone in a community where that electricity is being produced.
So you're saying there's a trickle down.
Because another world is possible, that we should care, that we can flip a light switch and we can get everything that we're experiencing now without having the negative impacts.
So the trickle down effect, you talked to me about that before. So just because you might feel like you can do a drive-by and you don't live in that area, then you should care because eventually the air is coming to your area, is basically what you're saying.
That pollution is going to affect you too.
Okay. 15 years later, we have only about 3.5 minutes. 15 years later, talk about some of the positives that you've seen made in regard to social justice. And you can talk about those conversely or, in coordination with what work still needs to be done.
That's a great question. I am really fortunate to be working with strong communities across the nation, particularly in the South, that are moving us forward in this regard. And so it could be communities in Houston that have worked really diligently to make sure that equity is a part of their new transit plan. And so when a transit plan that was inequitable came before their decision makers, a community was loud enough to push back, and that plan was not approved. I think that's a really exciting development to see that this is catching on and it's working. In a place here in North Carolina, we have been fighting against the Atlantic Coast Pipeline here, and communities in Virginia, which was a pipeline that was going to come through primarily Black communities, Indigenous communities, and low wealth communities, and quite frankly, be a threat to their drinking water. And so the fact that that project was canceled, that's a victory. And so I'm excited that we're seeing victories on so many different fronts every single day, not only here in the US, but globally, and that the people who are fighting are getting savvier, and that other people who haven't traditionally supported them are now paying attention and bringing new resources. And that's what the Hive Fund seeks to do, is to be able to talk about these issues in ways that are relatable, and bring in new resources and new people to help fight these persistent challenges that really are the challenges of our day.
Okay, and what work still has to be done? You've talked about a lot of it, but what is there still to do? What are agencies and organizations like yours needing to do, and what are others needing to do?
One of the most important things for us is to accurately diagnose the problem. I think it's really difficult for folks to engage when they hear people talk about parts per million or air pollution or CO2. We know that that's a byproduct, and that is something that we want to address. But for us, it really is, how do we understand that this is about economic systems, us being, addicted to economic systems that make pollution profitable. And so I think if we understand this as an economic problem, we begin to understand this as an economic solution. in which we can all play a part, that you don't have to be a scientist with a special degree to be able to play a part, to decide where your energy comes from or where you're going to buy your goods based on how they're producing it and if it's in a way that's harming communities or not.
What
I think
inspires you? I want to ask you what we have a less than a minute. What inspires you every day, Melanie, to continue in this work?
I am inspired every day by communities that are living with these awful conditions that, are winning and fighting back against one of the most well-resourced industries in the history of the world, that are fighting back, that are winning, that are banding together, and that are building our new reality. We're in a period of transition, and they are those who are seeing beyond the mountain and who are doing the difficult work of bringing us all along to a future in which not only those that are most wealthy get to experience the benefits of our environment, but where we all get to experience it together without the disproportionate harms that are affecting these communities now.
Okay, well, that's our time. Thank you so much for that insight that you gave us today. Of course, we like to end our show with some bites or bullet points that our viewers can take with them from what you talked about. One of the points you brought up, Melanie, was that people who are experiencing the most of challenges and who are most impacted are the ones that should be part of the problem, that they know how to solve the problem and they need to sit at the table with other decision makers in the beginning as opposed to at the end and help to make a plan for change. You also talked about accurately diagnosing the problem and that only doing that is going to help you to fix the problem. You have to know exactly what the problem is. And finally, you talked about being inspired by people. There are people that you meet and you work with that are building a new reality, and that is what keeps you going and keeps your drive up and this passion that you have for social change and social justice. Well, I thank you so much for your time. And to find out more about the High Fund for Climate and Gender Justice, you can look on the organization's website. I have that information for you. Also, if you have a question that you would like to ask Melanie, just log on to the website, podbiteswithverna.com. Go over to the subscription page and the comments page, and you can just go ahead and ask it there. That is it for this edition of Podbites with Verna. Thank you again, Melanie, so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
We, of course, are going to have another episode of Podbites next Sunday. I look forward to seeing all of you there. Until then, have a great week. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.